All right, so if you're following along, we're going to be in the book of Acts, chapter 17 this morning. And what I really want to talk about this morning, we're going to be looking at this unique interaction between Paul and some Greek philosophers, and we're going to be taking it as an example of the way that our faith, Christianity, interacts with the culture in which it finds itself. So we're going to be starting in verse 16. And a little bit of context for this passage. You know, Paul has just recently been journeying among the Macedonians, made contact with some groups that he'll later write letters to. But upon first contact, he's not received very well. He basically gets chased out of town. They bring him down into Greece as like a safer harbor. So Paul is currently staying in the city of Athens, kind of the cultural capital of the area. And in verse 16 we hear, now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him as he was observing a city full of idols. A characterization of Athens that is probably very true for this time period. The name of the city, Athens, derives from the name of the Greek goddess Athena. And it's thought that the city was first named Athens because way back, hundreds of years before this, in the time period where people were first deciding that cities needed names, visitors would come to the city of Athens and see all of these giant statues of the goddess Athena, and they referred to it as the place of the Athenas, which is Athens. So Paul is staying here in Athens, kind of waiting for things to cool down up north in Macedonia. And Paul, who, as you read the story of Acts, you'll notice is notoriously short-tempered. His anger is perhaps his greatest flaw. But while he's hiding out, laying low, he just can't handle the sight of all of these idols throughout the city. And Paul doesn't allow himself in Athens to lay very low. Verse 17 we see, so he was reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearers, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. So Paul is going back to his old way of doing things, going straight to the synagogue, the way he usually enters a city, talking with the Jews and the God-fearers. God-fearers, by the way, is a term that you'll see sometimes in the book of Acts. It basically refers to non-Jews that are sympathetic to the Jews. In different time periods in ancient Rome, it was kind of trendy for, especially upper-class women to, eat kosher and stuff. So there are some, people that are culturally connected to Judaism that are the God-fearers. You hear, the centurion that Peter meets with earlier in the book of Acts is also described this way. And Paul is not confining himself to the synagogue. He's going out to the agora, the marketplace, and just talking with whoever is there, anyone that will talk to him. And he catches the attention of some notable locals in verse 18. And also some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers were conversing with him. Some of them were saying, "What does this idle babbler have to say?" While others said, "He seems to be a proclaimer of strange gods," because he was talking about Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, May we know what this new teaching is that you are proclaiming. For you are bringing some strange things to our ears, and we want to know what they mean. We get a little parenthetical. Now all the Athenians and the foreigners visiting there used to spend their time in nothing other than hearing or telling something new. So Paul, in his interactions in Athens, has established contact with these philosophic circles. They're interested by what he has to say, although you can see clearly they don't understand it very much at first. The more pessimistic of the philosophers portray Paul with this language of, my translation said idle babbler. You see that phrase changes a lot based on what translation you're looking at. The Greek is a little ambiguous, but it basically amounts to some person who's just picking up little scraps of, things that they heard and stitching them together into something that looks like a story. It's this idea of someone who talks but doesn't know what they're talking about. These Greek thinkers take Paul and they bring him to the Areopagus. Areopagus, you may have also heard of, called Mars Hill. Areopagus comes from the Greek Areopagos, which literally means the hill of Ares. And this change in setting, there are a couple ways to think about it, which is that the Areopagus, by this time in Greek history, had kind of developed a reputation for exactly what's going on right now, which is a bunch of philosophic types gathering around and just talking. But the Areopagus, traditionally in Athens, had been a site for trials, specifically trials relating to religious matters. If you did something that was considered a crime against the gods, you would be dragged up to the Areopagus, and that's where your trial would happen. So there's this kind of sense that Paul is being brought forward and asked to defend himself against the traditional religion of the Greeks. And Paul begins talking. And it's interesting, the language that he uses. It's been argued, let me read for you the next verse so I can talk about this more fully. So Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "O men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects." And he goes on, but I just want to talk about this for a moment. It has been said that Paul may be very aware of what he's doing here with the way he opens his speech. He addresses them, "O men of Athens," which is the exact same way that another famous speech in Athens began quite earlier, the trial of Socrates. Socrates, if you don't know, is a famous Greek philosopher, and he's pretty much the only figure in Greek history that all of these philosophers would have looked up to. He's kind of the George Washington of ancient Athens. That, there are a lot of people in the United States today with a lot of different opinions. But generally, everyone has some amount of respect for George Washington, and they see him as like the originator of the United States. And in the same way, all of these different philosophers in Athens have very different ideas and frequently get into conflict with each other, but they all look back on Socrates as something of a founding figure. Socrates, about 400 years before this, was put on trial for a variety of crimes, including corrupting the youth, atheism, and worshiping strange gods. And it is kind of a famous observation to say how seriously that trial must have been taken if he's accused of both atheism and worshiping strange gods. Paul opens his speech in the exact same way with this appeal to men of Athens. And he begins the speech by complimenting the listeners. I see that you're very religious in every way. He goes on, "For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. And Paul is going for a classic speech delivery tactic here of you start your speech by complimenting your audience, and then you come for them. So Paul, notes how pious the Athenians are, and he takes particular interest in this inscription to the unknown God. But he goes on to say, God does not dwell in temples made with hands, which, if you know your, excuse me, if you know your geography of Athens, the Areopagus, where Paul is standing, he could very well be almost literally in the shadow of the Parthenon, which is one of the largest temples in the world at this point, and houses a 20, 30 foot tall statue of the goddess Athena. So Paul can probably see this from the place where he's standing. And it's this very sharp critique that, the Parthenon is really the center of Athenian religious and civic life. And there's this idea, and this is one of the things that Christians in the Roman Empire would catch so much persecution for. That the Roman mentality was that you have to offer to the gods, you have to support the gods, so that the gods will continue to bless the state. And there's a similar attitude in Athens, the idea that the Athena that lives in the Parthenon needs to be served so that Athena will continue to bless the city. And Paul, also runs into the same kind of attitude in Ephesus when he criticizes the goddess Artemis a little too loudly. And there are all these pagan ideas about the reciprocal nature between the state and the gods that Paul is condemning here, and that many of his listeners would likely be rather concerned about with his attitudes. That if people follow Paul, if people follow the Christian message, they'll abandon the gods, and so the gods will abandon us. And Paul, says, the God that I'm proclaiming to you, this God is not served by human hands because he doesn't need anything. Rather, he gives to all people life and breath and all things. Paul frames our God as, in a sense, merciful and generous, in contrast to the pagan gods that are like a savvy businessman that do for you what you can do for them. And Paul goes on. If we read the next section, he says, "And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, although he is not far from each of us." And here, I think you see a little bit of an answer to what you heard earlier in the passage. They describe Paul, in verse 18 as a proclaimer of strange gods. And this is another pagan idea that would run against Paul's preaching. There's an attitude in the ancient world that says, we're the Greeks and we have our Greek gods. The Romans over there have their Roman gods. The Egyptians have their own Egyptian gods. And we all stay to ourselves and we all cast our lot with our gods. It's a little bit messy, but when you read ancient texts, there seems to be an attitude in which, your average Greek would probably say the Egyptian gods, yes, that they exist, they're real, but they are someone else's gods, and we need to foster the relationship with our gods because, obviously we're the Greeks and we're the best, so our gods are the best. And Paul is disintegrating this kind of tribalistic, nationalist approach to religion. Whereas the Greeks portray him as a proclaimer of strange or foreign gods, Paul says, this is no foreign god. The God that I serve is the creator, sustainer, and king of the entire world, regardless of whether you're a Greek or a Roman or an Egyptian or a Jew. God is the one who's responsible for creating all of them, and he's the one to which they all ultimately owe their existence and their allegiance. And Paul goes on. And this next verse is very interesting. I actually have some things on my phone that I've saved that I'd like to show you in a second. So Paul says, "For in him we live and move and have our being. As even one of your own poets said, we also are all his children." Let me see here. No. So that version, and my version as well, do not include quotation marks on the first part of this verse, even though it actually is a quote. In this single verse, Paul is making reference to two different excuse me. I'm alright. I saw some concern there. I'm alright. That was a cough, I swear. Oh, sorry, I got something in my chest.
We're calling the squad, Tyler.
Oh, yeah, of course. Lexi doesn't like that. So in this single verse, Paul is making reference to two different early Greek thinkers. In the first part, we get a reference to this fellow by the name of Epimenides. Epimenides also is significant for this story because thank you so much. Epimenides is also significant because according to legend, Epimenides is actually the person who first puts up the stone that says, "To the unknown God." The story goes that is something that Epimenides orders the people of Athens to put up in order to dispel a plague that's infecting the city. And this first part of the verse for in him we live and move and have our being, is a direct quote from a book written by Epimenides. I'd like to read for you a little bit of the context in which that quote appears. It's very interesting. And, fans of the letter to Titus will recognize something else in this quote. So Epimenides in his book says, "They fashioned a tomb for you, O holy and most high one. Cretans are always liars, evil beasts and idle bellies. For you are not dead, you alive. You are alive and dwell forever. For in you we live and move and have our being." Epimenides in his book is talking about, because Epimenides himself is a Cretan, and Epimenides is talking about the structure that the Cretans have built called the Tomb of Zeus. And he's arguing that, what a stupid thing to build. Zeus is alive. He's, doing all of these things. And this is where we get the famous quote, "Cretans are always liars." And the second part of this verse also is a reference to another Greek writer, whom Paul simply calls one of your own poets. His name is Aratus. And I'll read for you a little bit of the context from which that quote is taken. So Aratus, in his poem, says, "Let us begin with Zeus, whom we mortals never leave unspoken. For every street, every marketplace is full of Zeus. Even the sea and harbor are full of him. Everywhere, everyone is indebted to Zeus, for we also are all his children." And you'll notice something very strange about this verse. At least I noticed something very strange about it. Which I suppose you can decide for yourself whether it's surprising or not. Which is that Paul references two Greek writers and applies their ideas to God, even though both of those writers in their original context were talking about Zeus. And we see this shifting of the focus. Paul is, in a sense, acknowledging the Greek tradition and all of the beauty and wisdom that has come from it. And Paul has this unique perspective. He praises the Athenians at the beginning, that they were pious in all regards. He praises the inscription to an unknown god, and here he's refocusing references originally about Zeus to make them about God. And it seems like Paul is seeing in the Greek culture these kind of seeds of the word, you could say. Is a term that some people have used. That we go on and we'll read a little bit more here, I believe. But we already have seen, Paul say that all of the peoples of the earth have been created that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he's not far from each of us. To join Paul's bandwagon of quoting ancient poets, Cicero famously said, "Nature itself impresses upon the minds of all the idea of God." And there's this sense, I think, in which Paul is looking at the Greek culture and the Greek tradition, and he's seeing this impulse upwards. The people of Athens, even though they have not been exposed to any great extent to Judaism or Christianity, have a natural desire to look for something above them. They seek out all of these higher powers. And when they look at their own pantheon, all of these gods that they see when they look into the heavens, they still feel like it isn't enough. They look at Zeus and Poseidon and Athena, and they say, something isn't adding up here. Something isn't making sense. There must be something more that we don't know. There must be some extra piece that makes this puzzle fit. So they pull up altars that say, to an unknown god. And some of their poets and their philosophers, like Paul has mentioned, they try to climb out of this muck of Greek religion. Anyone that knows Greek mythology knows that it gets rather messy. Zeus, as much as he is the king of the gods, is in no way a good god. He has many character flaws throughout a lot of the stories told about him. And there's this pushback in Greek culture about some of this. There are poets like the Greek writer Hesiod, who try to separate Zeus away from all of the stories that have gotten attached to him and say, if this system is going to make sense, we need to have some god who isn't a part of all of this mess. We need to have someone who's fair and impartial and just. And I think Paul is recognizing all of these attitudes in Athens and saying, I'm coming here to tell you that missing piece that you've been looking for. I'm here to tell you the thing you've been trying to reach up towards but haven't been able to fully understand. And Paul goes on with his conclusion from this argument. He says, being then the children of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and thought of man. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all people everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness, through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead. So this is the conclusion of the argument. And it's interesting the way that Paul approaches the Athenians. It's very different from really almost any other speech or letter that we get from Paul. You read Paul in his letters, or you read like his defense before the Sanhedrin, and Paul loves nothing more than hitting you with a quote from the Old Testament every couple of verses. Paul is a Pharisee. That is his background. Some historians, some accounts of tradition even claim that Paul in his early days was like being groomed to one day step into a position of authority like the high priest. Paul was tutored by a rabbi who's so significant that we would know his name even if Paul had never existed, because he's still remembered as a great interpreter of the Old Testament in Jewish circles. Paul has an incredibly deep background in the Old Testament. But in this unique context, Paul knows who he's talking to. Paul knows that if he stood in front of the Areopagus and began quoting the Old Testament, at best, no one would know what he was talking about. Probably the majority of these guys have never even heard of the books he would be quoting. And so Paul kind of meets them where they are, and demonstrating, I think, how shockingly well-educated Paul is, he begins to quote from them extensively from their own cultural writings, and forms his argument from that, to which he gets to the conclusion of the gospel, to the death and resurrection of Christ and the need for all people everywhere to come to him. I think that It's an idea often talked about in apologetics. This idea that if you merely contemplate the world around you, you begin to see the fingerprints of God, that creation testifies to its creator. Paul, although he understands the gravity of the Old Testament prophecies about Jesus, also thinks that those, as a background, are not even strictly necessary for one to see the value in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That if you spend enough time in this world, see how things are, look deep into your own soul and compare it to the world around you, you see that all of this came from somewhere. You see that the world is broken, but inside you, you have a deep feeling that it shouldn't be. Things are bad, and you know that there's this deep human sense that things are not the way they are supposed to be. Which is universal and which Paul speaks to here. Let's conclude reading the chapter, and then I'll have some additional thoughts. Now, when they heard, they being our philosopher crowd, now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some of them began to sneer, but others said, "We would like to hear you again concerning this." So Paul went out from their midst. But some people joined him and believed. Among them were Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So, a question to ask ourselves at the end here is the extent to which Paul's speech is a success. It is certainly a success for these men and women who have their lives changed for it, Dionysius and Damaris and the others whose names aren't recorded for us. I think it's certainly a success in the extent that from this very moment you can trace as one of the points at the what's the phrase in here? You can trace this as one of the points at the beginning of the Christianization of Greece. That from this and certain other moments that will come, Christianity begins to spread among the Greek people until eventually it is the dominant cultural force and remains so to this day. And also, well, we, especially when you're talking yourself, you have a tendency to focus on the people who sneer, right? Which Paul is not without here. But it's important to remember, each of us is a small-scale evangelist. Each of us meets people all throughout our lives who need the message of Christ. And each of us inevitably will meet people who sneer. And that's unfortunate, but it's important to orient yourself to realize that they're not the particularly important ones. That as long as the message is having an impact, it doesn't really matter if other people make fun of it. To Dionysius and Damaris, does it matter that the other philosophers thought that the resurrection was something to be laughed at? And on an individual note, I'm sure Paul might consider this speech a success because it's one of the only speeches he ever delivers that doesn't end with him running away from a stoning. It's kind of an interesting contrast, actually. If you read most of the book of Acts, usually the pattern is Paul shows up, says something controversial about the message of Jesus, and then he gets run out of town and threatened with death. Here in Athens, even at the Areopagus, the place of religious trial, the response that Paul gets is not an openly hostile one. The message that he gets from the council is, "We'd like to hear you again about this." And it is notable that in the phrasing of the chapter, that group is somewhat separate from the group that believes. We see that there's the separate group who believe and follow, and they're counted separately from the group that asks to hear more. I think that perhaps what we're supposed to imagine, since as we know from verse 21, the Athenians and foreigners visiting there did nothing but hear and talk about something new, that there's a significant part of this group who sits there and goes, interesting. And that's really the only reason that they ever came here, is to ultimately have the experience of sitting there and going, interesting. I think that there's virtue in healthy skepticism, in wanting to make sure that the things you believe are true, about wanting to be thorough and that sort of thing. But I do think there is a vice corresponding that we could see exhibited here in this chapter a little bit, of the person who wants to hear all the ideas and wants to think about them all, but never wants to do anything about it. You could refer to the famous quote, "Be not hearers of the word, but doers of the word." We hear a lot of things. As Christians, we gather together pretty regularly to hear someone get up here and talk about the Bible and God. And it's too easy to hear those things and then store them in your mind as like intellectually interesting but not relevant to my day-to-day. I think that a lesson we could take from this is that we need to act upon the things that we know. And the things that we know about God in particular are relevant to how we live our lives. If we live our lives the way that, the ancient pagans did, believing that the gods need our service, they need us to build their little statues that they live in and to provide them offerings. Of course, no one in the modern world believes quite that thing, but there are many philosophies that look very similar to it. If we live our lives believing that us and the universe, the gods or God, are on some kind of business partner basis, then our lives will look very different if we understand God to be the just, merciful, and generous King of the universe, which He truly is. What we understand about God impacts our attitude to Him, and through it, our attitude to everything that we do in our daily lives. A note also that I want to talk about here in this section. I promised you at the beginning that I wanted to talk a little bit about the interaction between Christianity and the culture in which it finds itself. And here we get an interesting example of that, right? We have Paul quoting all of these Greek texts and appealing to the cultural sensitivity of the Athenians in order to present to them the message of Jesus. And it's important to note both that when it is appropriate, Paul is complementary and referential to the Greek culture, and when it is appropriate, Paul is words are hard. Paul condemns the Greek culture. Paul sees the Greek attitude that strives upward as a good thing, and he sees its attitude of exchange between gods and man as a bad thing, and he names it as such. And I think it would be very easy. To imagine, a parallel version of events where Paul marches into Athens and doesn't quote any of these Greek texts, doesn't pay any attention to the local culture, and comes in and says things like, "I can't believe you're eating pigs. You heathens. You all need to be circumcised." Paul does not come into Greece with the intent of pressing upon them Jewish culture. Rather, he acknowledges Greek culture and sees in it something that is capable of redemption and which has a place in the full worship of God. Paul says, he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitations. While it is true that the Christian God is, in one sense, a Jewish God, that God has chosen to reveal himself in history through the Jewish people, that is the unique avenue of revelation that he has chosen. In another very real sense, God is no more a Jewish God than he is a Greek God. God is the God of all people in all places. And all people, as we see from this verse, are created by God. And God has appointed their times and the boundaries of their habitation, as the verse says. I think that when we go out into our own culture, the culture in which we live, the American culture, I don't think many of us are traveling very far. We're not going out to Thailand to talk about, Jesus in a Thai context. If you were, then that would be a larger conversation, I suppose. But when we talk about the dialogue between the church and the culture, I think that there is too much of an attitude of culture war, right? The idea that it's the church versus the outside. Two men enter, one man leaves. When that really isn't the attitude we should be having. We should take a critical look at our culture. We should condemn it where it is appropriate and necessary to do so. There are certainly elements of the American culture, as there are in every culture all around the world, that are not compatible with the nature of God and his calling for mankind. But there are many parts of different cultures that fit perfectly into that picture. Cultures think differently. They have different histories and traditions. They value different things differently. There's a famous, I don't know how famous it is actually, now that I say that. There's a section from one of C.S. Lewis's books where he says, good and evil are, paths going in opposite directions. The further you go down one, the more distinct you become from something on the other side. And he said, but also, what we often don't realize is that both of them are branching paths themselves. That if you go down the path of good, there are different ways to go in it. You can be a good person and be the type of person who is, cloistered up in a library, reading and writing and dealing with intellisthesia, and that type of thing. Or you can be the type of person who's out on the streets, just talking to people there, doing good for the people you encounter there. And he says, this idea of, the cloistered monk doing his intellectual study and the street preacher, handing out food to passers-by. Both of these are good. And if the Christian church is to succeed and flourish, it needs people of both types. But yet the two of them look quite different. We look at the different cultures in the world, and I think we see something similar. In the United States, there are many things in American culture that are good and redeemable and should be used to their fullest extent for the glory of God. American culture, we really we have a strong idea of hard work, diligence, industry. It's something that's very important to us, and it's something that I believe is good and ought to be there in us. American culture has a strong idea of I guess you could call it mutual respect. This idea of seeing others generally as their own agents living independently. Whereas other cultures, you might say, too often see people merely as parts of a group. And I think that is good. And I think that there are other cultures throughout time and place that have had different attributes. The culture of ancient Rome valued bravery, which by every means is a good thing. The culture of ancient Greece valued intelligence, which they absolutely should. I think that we need to, as a church, dialogue with the culture in which we find ourselves. We need to take the elements of the culture that are good, that reflect God, and we need to latch onto those, and we need to incorporate them into ourselves and to use them as a venue through which to bring the Christian message into the wider culture. And we need to be critical of the things that don't fit into that picture, which is a much more nuanced and much more complicated view than merely, we need to go railroad this culture and tear it down in order to make way for something new. Because I don't believe that that's the attitude of Paul in this passage or anywhere. So that's the idea this morning. And I hope that you all contemplate this passage. There are, like I said, multiple things here to talk about, including things that I haven't even fully had the time to go into. It's a very deep passage, rather famous, and for good reason. I hope that we see it as an example of how we should reach out to the people around us. And I hope that we see the particular comments made by Paul as shaping our mindset towards God, towards our relationship with Him as a God not that does business with us, but a God which gives generously to us. And with that all said, would you bow, and I'll pray for us here.